It's just the two of us here, Alien said, ready to face the impossible. The stars stretched out like a sea of cold, distant lights, each one a potential danger, an untold mystery waiting to unfold. Ethan Blackwell stood at the observation window of the Alliance's headquarters, his arms crossed over his chest. His dark eyes, filled with quiet intensity, traced the unfamiliar constellations in the vast expanse of the galaxy. He wasn't one for sentimentality, but there was something unsettling about this mission. He could feel it in his bones. Lieutenant Blackwell, a voice broke through his thoughts, smooth and professional. Ethan turned to see Captain Merrill approaching. "You're being reassigned to the Astral Voyager." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The cargo ship," the captain nodded. "The same. You've been specifically chosen for this assignment. We need you to protect it on its journey." He wasn't sure if he felt honored or burdened by the request. Ethan had a reputation one forged in the fire of countless battles in the galaxy's darkest corners. He was no stranger to danger, but this was different. A cargo ship wasn't exactly a battlefield, and the mission wasn't to fight off enemy forces. It was to protect the Astral Voyager from dangers unseen, far from the prying eyes of civilization. "I'll take the job," he said, the words sounding more like a command to himself than an agreement to the captain. "Good. We'll brief you on the specifics as you board. Be prepared for anything." Blackwell Captain Merrill added a stern warning, hanging in the air. Ethan's thoughts continued to churn as he boarded the ship, his mind running through every scenario that could unfold. The Astral Voyager wasn't a military vessel. It wasn't designed to fight. It was a transport ship carrying goods and supplies through the uncharted territories of space. And that's what made the mission so dangerous. The uncharted regions of space were filled with dangers, some known, most unknown. Rogue space pirates, hostile alien life forms, and unknown anomalies. It was the perfect environment for an ambush. But what troubled Ethan the most was the secrecy surrounding this mission. There was more to it than just a routine escort. The cargo the Voyager was carrying was classified, and that made Ethan uneasy. He didn't like not knowing the full story. In his line of work, ignorance could get you killed. As he entered the main hangar bay, his gaze swept across the familiar hum of the ship's bustling crew. The Astral Voyager was a sleek, well-maintained vessel, but it lacked the military sophistication of the Alliance's combat ships. No shields capable of withstanding sustained attacks, no heavy weaponry, no fleet of fighters to back them up. It was in essence a sitting duck, and Ethan would be its protector. A soft click echoed across the bay, and Ethan turned to see her. Laia Zalara, the ship's pilot, stood by the entryway to the bridge, her striking features illuminated by the faint light of the hangar. She was tall with a lithe frame that seemed to move with effortless grace. Her skin was an unusual shade of blue. Her hair, long and silver white, glimmered in the low light, while her eyes, a sharp and captivating gold, locked with his for just a moment before she turned her gaze away. Ethan didn't speak immediately, taking in her presence with a practiced eye. Her appearance alone was enough to make her stand out, an alien, a member of a race not native to Earth. But it wasn't just her exotic looks that caught his attention. It was the way she held herself, calm, composed, and yet there was something almost cold about her, as if she was detached from everything around her, floating in a world of her own. Ethan's first impression was that she was not the type to get close to anyone. She had a cool, aloof demeanor, her every movement precise and deliberate, as if calculating her next step in an intricate dance. And yet something about her intrigued him. Was it her confidence, the mystery surrounding her, or perhaps the quiet tension he could feel radiating from her, as if she were holding something back, something important? Lieutenant Blackwell Laia's voice was low and steady, a slight hint of curiosity in her tone as she greeted him. "I hear you're the one tasked with protecting the ship. Hope you're prepared for what's ahead." Ethan met her gaze, his own expression guarded. "I'll do my job. No one's getting past me." She nodded, her golden eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Good. We'll need it. The uncharted territories are unpredictable. We're not just dealing with space debris out there. There are far worse things waiting in the dark." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What exactly are we carrying anyway?" Laia didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, visible from the bay. "Classified. I'm afraid you'll have to wait for the briefing." He didn't like that. Ethan was a man who liked to know the full picture. And yet here he was, entrusted with a mission without all the pieces. It gnawed at him, that sense of not knowing, but he knew better than to press the matter further. Laia had made it clear that this wasn't up for debate. The ship hummed to life, the engines roaring softly as the astral voyager prepared to leave the safety of the known galaxy and venture into the uncharted depths. Ethan's boots clanged on the metal floors as he followed Laia through the narrow corridors, his mind racing. This wasn't just another job. There was something about this mission, something about Laia that made him uneasy, and he couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in. As they reached the bridge, the view of the endless void stretched out before them, an infinite sea of stars. Laia took her seat in the pilot's chair, her hands flying over the controls with expert precision. Ethan took his position near the back, keeping a close eye on the monitors. "We're entering uncharted space now," Laia said, her voice smooth and detached. "No telling what we'll find out there." Ethan stared at the screen, watching the stars shift as they jumped into faster-than-light travel. "I've been to the edges of the galaxy before. Trust me, I've seen worse." Laia didn't look up. "You've seen worse, maybe. But out here, everything is different. The unknown is alive, Blackwell, and it's waiting for us." Ethan could hear the faint trace of something beneath her words, a warning maybe, but he didn't press the matter further. He could feel the tension between them, the unspoken weight of the mission ahead. Neither of them spoke for a while, each lost in their thoughts as the stars streaked by, carrying them farther from everything they knew. The astral voyager was now in the depths of space, untouched by civilization, a ship adrift in a sea of mystery, and Ethan Blackwell, with his vast experience in iron, found himself in the one place he had never been before, truly uncertain. As the ship continued its journey into the void, the question lingered in Ethan's mind. What exactly was the astral voyager carrying, and what danger awaited them beyond the stars? The hum of the astral voyager's engines had become a constant background noise, familiar but never comforting. Yet in the strange emptiness of deep space, Ethan found solace in its rhythm. As the days passed, the proximity between him and Laia grew almost imperceptibly at first. It wasn't just the physical closeness of working together on the same ship. It was something more subtle, something in the way they spoke, in the way they shared their silences. Ethan had always kept his distance from others. He was used to working alone, trusting no one but himself. But with Laia, things felt different. He couldn't explain it, but there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken connection. Perhaps it was because she too seemed to carry a burden, an invisible weight that made her harder to approach, just like him. Over time, Ethan began to notice the little things about her: her focus and dedication when piloting the ship, her soft but precise way of speaking, and how she would occasionally glance at him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was a subtle warmth in her gaze that made him lower his guard just enough to see her as more than just a colleague. Her calm demeanor, in contrast to his more brash and impulsive nature, was almost soothing. It was as if Laia had this quiet ability to calm his storm of thoughts. The truth was, Ethan had spent years of his life bearing his emotions, focusing solely on the mission at hand. But now with her, there was something real, something grounding him in a way that he hadn't experienced since the loss of his family in the war. Ethan's past was a tangle of pain and isolation. Losing his family had left scars deeper than any wound he'd sustained in battle. But Laia, she didn't push him to talk about it. She didn't ask probing questions. It was as if she understood without ever needing to speak a word. It was this silent understanding that allowed him to start opening up piece by piece, letting her into a space he had locked away for so long. One evening after a particularly grueling shift, Ethan found himself sitting alone in the ship's small galley. He was nursing a drink, his thoughts drifting to the familiar ache in his chest, the loss of his parents, his brother, the weight of it all. That's when Laia joined him, the soft sound of her boots on the metal floor, the only indication she was there. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she sat across from him, her golden eyes studying him for a moment. There was no judgment in her gaze, no pity. She simply looked at him as though she understood his pain without needing him to say a word. After a long silence, Laia spoke quietly, her voice calm and steady. "You don't have to talk about it, but I'm here if you ever need to." Ethan, who was used to pushing people away, was surprised by how those simple words broke through the walls he had built around himself. It wasn't that she had solved his pain or taken it away, but in that moment it felt like someone saw him. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan let himself breathe, let the tension leave his body. Laia hadn't solved his grief, but she had made it bearable. She didn't force him to heal, she simply allowed him to exist with it. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something more. It was a connection that Ethan hadn't known he needed. In a life spent fighting battles, both external and internal, he hadn't expected to find someone who would see him for who he truly was, not the soldier, not the hardened veteran, but the man who still carried the wounds of his past. With Laia, there was a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement that they both had their own burdens to carry, but they didn't carry them alone. It wasn't a romantic bond yet, but it was something that felt just as important. It was trust, a slow-building trust forged through shared experiences, mutual respect, and a shared loneliness in the deep void of space. As the days on the astral voyager stretched into weeks, Ethan's trust in Laia deepened. It was subtle at first, but he began to feel that there was something more beneath her calm exterior, something she wasn't sharing with him. But even as doubt flickered at the edge of his mind, Ethan pushed it away. She had made it clear that this wasn't up for debate. Then one evening, as they were navigating through the uncharted space, Laia pulled him aside, her expression serious. "We need to talk." Laia said, her tone clipped and professional. She led Ethan to the ship's briefing room, her steps hurried. There was no small talk, no pleasantries, just the urgent need to get to the point. "I've received intel," she said once they were inside. "There's a coordinated attack being planned by a coalition of alien forces. They're targeting several of the Alliance's outposts, including some on the frontier. They'll hit within the next few weeks." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The implications were enormous. If these outposts were attacked, it would be a blow to the Alliance's defense network. And if the attackers were successful, the chaos could spread further, destabilizing the region. "How do you know this?" Ethan asked, his voice low, his suspicion rising. "You're a pilot, Laia. This doesn't fit with your role on this ship." She paused for a moment, her eyes avoiding his. "I've got connections," she said cryptically. "I've been tracking their movements for a while. This is bigger than we thought." The room was silent for a long moment, the gravity of her words settling in. Ethan felt a chill in his bones. He didn't fully trust her, he couldn't, but the information was too important to dismiss. The Alliance needed to know this, but how could he be sure this wasn't some elaborate ploy? How could he know for certain that Laia wasn't part of the very group planning the attack? Ethan's mind raced, but he didn't show it on his face. "And why are you telling me this? You know how classified information like this is handled?" Laia's eyes hardened, and she took a step closer to him, her voice almost a whisper. "Because I need your help. The information I've gathered is too sensitive to be sent through normal channels. The Alliance won't act fast enough. I need you to protect this ship, and I need you to trust me." Ethan could feel his pulse quickening. He wanted to trust her. There was something about her that made him want to believe her, but doubt lingered, a shadow just out of reach. "I don't know if I can trust you, Laia," he admitted, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. "You're asking me to believe in something I don't fully understand. Something that could destroy everything." She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something: guilt. Fear, it was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it left him wondering. As the conversation ended, Ethan's suspicions began to grow. There had been something about Laia's last words, something that didn't sit right with him. The way she'd avoided his eyes when explaining the information, the cryptic nature of her explanations. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that she had never once mentioned why she was on the astral voyager in the first place, beyond the vague pilot designation. There was something more, and that made Ethan uncomfortable. Could she really be trusted? Was she a part of this larger conspiracy, or was she playing a dangerous game, trying to protect the Alliance in her own way? The question lingered in Ethan's mind as he watched Laia leave the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. There was a lot he didn't know about her, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. The air inside the ship's control room was thick with tension as Laia Zalara sat across from Ethan Blackwell. The soft hum of the astral voyager's engines filled the silence between them, but it was a deafening noise to Ethan's ears. They had been navigating the uncharted territories for weeks now, and for that entire time, a sense of trust had been building between them. Ethan, despite his usual skepticism, had started to believe in Laia, at least in her commitment to their mission. He had started to see her not just as a colleague, but as someone with her own quiet strength, someone who perhaps, like him, had her own scars. But that trust was about to shatter. Ethan could sense it before she even spoke. Blackwell. Laia began, her voice surprisingly steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. There's something I need to tell you, something important. He looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. What is it? His instincts told him this wasn't going to be easy to hear. He could see it in her posture, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she were preparing herself for the hardest part of the conversation. I'm not just a pilot on this ship, she said quietly, the words almost too soft for Ethan to catch at first. I'm here on a mission for a faction that, she paused searching for the right words, that is not aligned with the Alliance. Ethan's heart sank. For a moment it felt as though the floor beneath him had given way, and the weight of her words pressed down on him. What are you talking about? He stood up abruptly, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the strange tension that had been building in the air between them. He had always trusted her to some extent, but now everything felt like it was falling apart. Laia continued, her gaze unwavering, though her expression had hardened. I'm part of a covert organization. We're opposed to the Alliance's control over the galaxy. We're fighting for what we believe is a more just order, even if it means going against everything the Alliance stands for. Ethan's mind began to spin. All those moments when he had thought he was beginning to understand her, those were lies. Everything about her was a lie. The easy rapport, the silent understanding, the shared nights talking about the future, none of it was real. Ethan felt the betrayal deep in his chest like a blade twisting. Why was all Ethan managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with disbelief. Why would you do this? Why would you help the people you've been helping all this time? You've been part of this conspiracy. Laia's face softened slightly, but her eyes remained cold. It wasn't always like this. I didn't know what I was getting into when I was recruited. But now, I can't deny it anymore. I've seen what we're capable of. I've seen the destruction we've caused in the name of something that at first seemed just. But it's not just anymore, Ethan. He could feel a surge of anger in him, though it was quickly tempered by the hurt that laced his every thought. Laia had been the one person on this ship he had allowed himself to trust, and now she was telling him she was working against everything he believed in. His gut told him she was lying, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes suggested that she wasn't. Ethan, I didn't want this to be the way it happened. She continued, her voice softer now, almost pleading. But I need you to understand something. My allegiance to them, it's not simple. I was manipulated just like you were once. We all have our reasons. Stop! Ethan cut her off, his voice sharp. You want me to believe you now after everything? His chest heaved with frustration. He'd seen betrayal before, but nothing like this. Nothing this close, this personal. He wasn't sure if he could ever look at her the same way again. You've been lying to me, to everyone on this ship. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now? Laia looked away, guilt flashing across her features for a split second before she steeled herself. I'm not asking you to trust me, not yet, but I'm asking you to listen. There's more going on here than you realize. Ethan felt his mind racing as he processed what Laia had just confessed. He had been so sure that he was doing the right thing by trusting her, by bringing his guard down. But now everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He had been living a lie, and it was difficult to come to terms with that. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to cut ties with her immediately, but something deep within him, something he couldn't quite explain, told him that the situation was far more complicated than he could see in that moment. Tell me more, Ethan said, his voice harsh as he crossed his arms over his chest. Tell me everything. Laia met his gaze for a long moment, the weight of her secret heavy between them. The organization I work for is a faction that believes the Alliance is too corrupt to survive. They have a vision for the galaxy that doesn't rely on the control of one centralized government. They believe in breaking down the power structures that keep the galaxy in check, even if that means resorting to violence, chaos, and manipulation. Ethan listened intently, but his anger was only growing. So you've been working for terrorists, for rebels who think they can take down an entire civilization because they think it's corrupt. She didn't flinch at his words. It's more complicated than that, Ethan. We don't just want to tear it down. We want to build something better. But we can't do that as long as the Alliance is standing in our way. Ethan turned away from her, struggling to contain the emotions surging through him. His thoughts were a whirl of confusion and disbelief. He didn't know what to believe anymore. And the worst part was, he wasn't sure he could trust his own judgment in this moment. I don't know if I can keep working with you, Laya, he finally said, his voice tight. Not after everything you've just said. I can't be a part of this. I can't work with someone who believes in that someone who's willing to destroy everything just for some idea of better. Laya's gaze softened, a flicker of pain flashing in her eyes. I understand, but I need you to know something, Ethan. I'm not who I was when I first joined them. I'm not a blind follower anymore. I see the flaws and I see the destruction. I'm beginning to question everything. Ethan turned back to face her. And what do you want me to do with that? How can I trust you when you've been working for them all this time? Laya took a slow step forward, her voice pleading. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm not the enemy you think I am. I'm starting to realize the truth of it all. The lies, the manipulation. I'm not sure where I stand anymore. There was silence between them. Ethan's mind whirled as he weighed her words. Could she change? Could she really turn away from everything she had been a part of? Could she stand with the Alliance again? Or was this all some part of a larger game that he could never truly understand? Ethan didn't have the answers, but for the first time he was willing to listen. Maybe you can change, Laya, Ethan said quietly, but I don't know if I can trust you enough to find out. The first signs of the attack came swiftly, as they always did. One moment the astral Voyager was cruising through the uncharted void, its sleek hull gliding silently through the stars. The next, the ship shook violently, a deep reverberation that sent vibrations coursing through the walls. Ethan was thrown forward, his hand instinctively grabbing the nearest console to steady himself. Report. Ethan barked, his heart pounding in his chest. Laya's voice was a calm contrast to his rising tension. We've been hit. I'm getting an unknown signature, multiple ships, but they're not responding to any standard Alliance frequencies. It's not a routine attack. The unfamiliarity of the threat hit Ethan like a cold wave. This wasn't just a pirate raid or a random assault. Whoever these attackers were, they weren't just after supplies or a quick raid. They had a clear, focused intent, and it was on the astral Voyager. Are we the target? Ethan demanded, moving toward the tactical station. They know we're carrying something valuable, Laya replied, her fingers flying across the controls. Her normally composed demeanor had shifted, the focus in her eyes now sharpened, almost like a predator on the hunt. Ethan's stomach dropped. They're after the cargo. But why? Laya didn't answer immediately. Her hands worked faster as the ship rocked again, this time with a more violent jolt. Ethan gritted his teeth. What kind of forces are we dealing with? The lights flickered as another hit shook the ship, and Laya swore under her breath. We're dealing with something coordinated. These aren't just rogue raiders, they have advanced tactics. We need to act fast. The alien ships that had appeared on their radar were unlike any Ethan had seen before. They weren't cloaked in the usual technology of the raiders he had fought off in the past. The way they moved, synchronized, coordinated, indicated a military force, one with strategic planning, not just brute strength. Get us out of here, Ethan snapped. Laya's hands worked feverishly, but the damage was already done. We're not going anywhere, Blackwell. The warp drive is offline. We're stuck here. We'll have to fight our way out. The attackers had arrived in force. The cargo ship wasn't equipped for this kind of battle. Ethan knew that, but he also knew that their only option now was to survive. And that meant a full-on defense. Laya looked up at him, her voice steady but urgent. We need to work together. You have combat experience. I'll handle the systems and make sure we stay in the fight. You handle the defense. Ethan's mind raced. He had never fought alongside a pilot, at least not like this. He was used to the chaos of a ground skirmish, the brutality of combat on the battlefield. He wasn't accustomed to working with someone who controlled the movements of the ship from a distant console. "What's your plan?" he asked, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding in front of them. "I'll hack into their systems, disrupt their targeting, and give us a chance to retaliate." Laia said, her fingers moving in a blur across the controls. "I can also manipulate their sensors, but you'll need to take out the smaller ships coming our way. I'll have the ship's guns locked and loaded for you." Ethan nodded, understanding the urgency. There was no time to second-guess or question the plan. They were both in this together now, whether they liked it or not. He had always worked alone, always relied on his instincts and his own strength to get through the toughest situations. But this time he was counting on Laia's skills and her understanding of the ship's systems. He rushed to the weapons bay, locking his helmet in place. He could hear the distant rumble of alien fire hitting the hull. As he strapped into his seat, the sound of the ship's weapons powering up came through the speakers, a signal that they were about to go on the offensive. Ethan moved quickly to the cockpit, his body tensing as he prepared for the fight of his life. "We've got incoming." Laia's voice came through the comms, calm yet laced with urgency. "Get ready, Blackwell. I'm locking onto the enemy ships now. Keep them off our back." Ethan gripped the controls, his mind narrowing to a pinpoint focus. He could see the alien ships now, their sleek black forms darting through the stars like sharks circling a wounded prey. His hands worked the controls, lining up the first ship in his sights, firing off a volley of plasma rounds that rocked the enemy vessel. The attack was relentless. The alien ships were fast, their movements almost impossible to predict, and their tactics were unlike anything Ethan had encountered before. They didn't just engage in random assault, they moved like a hive, each ship supporting the others. But Laia had been right. She wasn't just any pilot. Her knowledge of the ship's systems, her ability to manipulate the very sensors that the alien ships relied on, gave Ethan the chance he needed to start picking off targets. The alien ships lost their tracking on him, their weapons missing by inches, as he darted through the void, unleashing precise shots that brought down one of the smaller craft. Laia's voice crackled over the comm. "They're trying to outflank us." "Stay sharp." Ethan gritted his teeth, lining up his next target. "I'm not done yet." Despite their best efforts, the odds seemed stacked against them. The alien ships were relentless, and no matter how many they brought down, more seemed to appear as though the attackers were willing to sacrifice their fleets just to take down the Astral Voyager. Ethan could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he continued to fight. Every shot, every dodge was a battle for survival, but the question lingered in the back of his mind. Would they make it out of this alive? A sharp warning light flashed in front of him, signaling an incoming barrage from one of the enemy ships. Laia's voice came through again, urgent and commanding. "Evasive maneuvers now, I've got a heavy lock on us." Ethan snapped his hands to the controls, flipping switches and sending the ship into a hard roll. The plasma blast from the alien craft missed them by mere inches, but the ship's hull groaned with the strain. "We can't keep this up forever, Laia," Ethan shouted. "We don't have a choice." Laia's voice was tight. "We have one last shot. If we can disable their command ship, the rest of them will scatter." Ethan looked out into the abyss, the massive alien ship looming ahead, flanked by smaller ships. His grip tightened on the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons. He didn't know if they could pull this off, but they had no choice. "Let's finish this," he muttered, slamming the throttle forward. The two of them worked in sync, each taking on their respective tasks with the focus of a seasoned warrior. Laia manipulated the ship's systems, creating openings for Ethan to make his moves. And with each shot, the alien ship seemed to get closer to breaking. But would it be enough? Could they truly escape this and destroy the enemy? The ship's hull shuddered again as another impact hit. Ethan felt the heat of the plasma blasts as if they were directed right at him. But with one final coordinated strike, they fired upon the command ship, sending it spiraling into the void. The remaining alien ships began to scatter, retreating in disarray. "Did we do it?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from the intensity of the fight. Laia's calm voice came through, but this time there was a trace of something lighter in it. "We did. But don't get comfortable yet. There's always another fight waiting out there." Ethan allowed himself a breath, leaning back in his seat. They had survived barely. But one question still lingered in the back of his mind. What would come next? The weight of Laia's confession continued to hang heavy between her and Ethan as the days passed. The chaotic battle with the alien forces had been only a temporary respite. Now more than ever, Laia felt the bitter sting of her choices. She had once believed in the cause she had joined, convinced that the faction she had allied herself with was right, that the alliance was corrupt, that the galaxy would never truly be free as long as the central power of the alliance held sway. But now as she looked at the wreckage of the battle, at the lives lost, she couldn't escape the feeling that she had been wrong. She sat in the small room near the ship's control center, her eyes gazing out the window at the swirling stars. The silence in the room was almost suffocating, and the hum of the ship's engines did little to ease the turmoil in her mind. Ethan's earlier words still echoed in her ears. "You've been lying to me, to everyone on this ship. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" Laia knew she couldn't change the past. The decision to join the faction had been made long ago, when she was younger, when she had still believed in their ideals without understanding the true cost of those beliefs. The missions they had carried out, the alliances they had forged, she had been a part of all of it. And now, as she considered the people she had hurt, the lives she had helped to destroy, she was haunted by guilt. But could she undo it all? Could she make amends for the destruction she had caused? It wasn't regret that drove Laia to her breaking point, but realization. She had once been so convinced that the Alliance was the enemy, that they represented everything that was wrong with the galaxy. But now, with the benefit of experience and a clearer view of the consequences, she understood how naive she had been. The organization she had joined wasn't just interested in reform, it was bent on chaos, on spreading a violent revolution without regard for the innocent lives that would be lost in the process. Laia's regret came not in the form of wishing she could undo the past, but in the realization that the path she had chosen was never as noble as she had once believed. She hadn't just been part of a resistance movement, she had been a pawn in a larger game manipulated by a group with no interest in anything but power. And now all she could do was question how far she could go to right the wrong she had been complicit in. Facing her guilt was not as simple as acknowledging her mistakes. Laia had spent so long hiding behind the ideals of the faction, justifying her actions as part of a greater good. But the cost of that belief had finally hit her, and now she could no longer pretend she was blind to the consequences. She was filled with an overwhelming sense of responsibility to the people she had betrayed, to Ethan and to herself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of the destruction they had caused, the casualties, the lives disrupted by the rebellion's chaos. She had always convinced herself that she was fighting for a noble cause, but now she saw the ugly truth. There was no nobility in the destruction they had left in their wake. Could she find a way to make up for it? Could she change? She didn't know, but she had to try. The first step, she realized, was to confront Ethan. She couldn't keep hiding behind excuses or lies. The truth was the only thing that could begin to heal the rift between them. She had betrayed him just like she had betrayed herself. Laia was no stranger to tough decisions, but this was the hardest one yet. She needed Ethan's trust, but how could she expect him to give it back after everything she had done, after everything she had hidden from him? The tension was palpable when Laia finally found Ethan standing in the control room, gazing out the view of the galaxy. She could feel the distance between them, the way the air seemed to thicken with unspoken words. He turned as she entered, his expression hard, unreadable. "I need to speak to you," Laia said quietly. Ethan didn't respond right away, but his posture stiffened, as if bracing himself for more lies. But he said nothing, and that silence was enough to make Laia's heart race. "I'm not who I was when I joined the faction," she began, her voice steady despite the rising storm inside her. "I see now that I was wrong. I thought I was fighting for something, but the truth is, I've been part of something that causes more harm than good." Ethan didn't speak. He just stood there staring at her with a mix of disbelief and pain in his eyes. The words hung in the air between them, but neither of them could bring themselves to break the silence. "I've seen the destruction, the manipulation. I've seen how far they'll go to push their agenda, regardless of who they hurt. And I can't be a part of it anymore," she said, her voice cracking slightly. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Laia wondered if he would turn away from her entirely. "So what now? You want me to just forget everything you've done, everything you've been a part of?" The bitterness in his voice stung, but Laia didn't flinch. "No, I don't expect you to forget. I don't even expect you to forgive me. I just need you to understand that I'm not the same person I was when I joined them, and I need to make things right. Starting with you." Ethan shook his head, disbelief still in his eyes. You really think you can just change all of that? Walk away from the chaos you've caused. I don't know, she replied softly, but I can't keep pretending I'm okay with it. I can't stay with them and continue down that path. The quiet between them stretched for what felt like an eternity, the weight of their words settling heavily on both of their shoulders. Laia could feel the distance between them widening, even though she was standing right in front of him. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice quieter than before. You don't get to just walk away from something like that, Laia. You've been part of something that's caused so much pain, and now you want me to believe you, want me to trust you again? Laia looked down, her guilt crushing her chest. I don't expect you to trust me, she whispered, but I have to try. In the days that followed, Laia could feel the tension in the air every time she and Ethan crossed paths. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about trust and how long it would take, if ever, to rebuild what had been broken. The situation with the alien faction was escalating. Their response to Laia's defection was swift and brutal. She received another encrypted message, this one far more menacing than the last. You've strayed too far, Laia. There is no place for deserters. Return now or face the consequences. Laia felt her stomach twist. They wouldn't let her go. She knew that now. The faction was not one to tolerate weakness or defection. If she refused to return, they would hunt her down. And if they couldn't catch her, they would make sure everyone around her paid the price. But there was no turning back. She couldn't let herself go back to them, not after everything she had seen. The message was clear, Laia could not simply leave. The faction was growing more ruthless as she distanced herself from their cause, and now they would make sure she knew there would be consequences. She had become a liability to them, and they would stop at nothing to make her return to the fold. As the days passed, the tension mounted. Ethan and Laia were on the run, both trying to reconcile their past with the uncertainty of what the future held. They couldn't fight this battle alone. We can't do this by ourselves, Laia, Ethan said one evening, his voice low. The Alliance needs to know what's going on. We can't take them on by ourselves. Not with the faction breathing down our necks. Laia nodded grimly. I know, but will they help us after everything I've done? Ethan looked at her, his expression hard, but not unkind. If we tell them everything, they'll have no choice. But we're going to have to pay a price. We'll have to fight for this, and we'll have to be ready for whatever comes next. The weight of their situation was unbearable, but Laia knew that Ethan was right. They had to fight together, and they had to rely on each other. No one else would come to their aid. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was one thing she was sure of. They couldn't give up now. They would have to make their stand. The decision to stand by Ethan's side to fight for the Alliance had not come easily for Laia. Her past, her allegiance to a faction that had once seemed so just, weighed heavily on her conscience. But the more she had learned about the destruction they had caused, about the manipulation and chaos she had helped perpetuate, the more she understood that she could never go back to them. She couldn't undo the mistakes she had made, but she could try to make things right. Laia knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to convince Ethan. She had betrayed him once before, and trust once broken was not easily repaired. But actions, however small, could speak louder than anything she could say. When she first approached Ethan, her heart was heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know if he would ever forgive her, but she had to try. I'm with you, she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. I'm done running. I'll fight for the Alliance. I'll fight for what's right. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his eyes searching her face as though trying to see whether she was telling the truth or just saying what she thought he wanted to hear. His eyes narrowed, a mixture of suspicion and something else, something closer to hope. But the lines on his face softened just enough for her to know that he was at least willing to listen. We don't have much time. Laia continued her words, taking on an urgency that mirrored her inner turmoil. But I'll do whatever I can to help the Alliance stop the invasion. We need to act now. Ethan looked away for a moment, his thoughts a tangled mess. It was clear from the set of his jaw and the stiff posture that he still struggled with the idea of working alongside her. But in the end, it was the weight of their mission, their shared goal, that pushed past his doubts. I'm not going to forget what you've done, Laia, he said, his voice rough but resolute. But if you're serious about this, Then we fight together. That's all I can give you." His words were not a promise of forgiveness, but they were something more in understanding. In that moment, Laia realized that she didn't need to earn his forgiveness right away. She just needed to prove that she was willing to fight for something bigger than herself. Time was running out. The alien forces were massing, and the Alliance had yet to mount a counter-offensive that would be enough to stop the invasion. Laia knew that she didn't have the luxury of time to prove her loyalty. Every second counted, and every moment they wasted meant more ground lost to the enemy. She had to act quickly, and so did Ethan. The two of them began working together more seamlessly, putting aside their differences, combining their strengths in a way neither of them had expected. But even as they fought side by side, Laia couldn't shake the nagging fear that she had arrived too late. Could she really make a difference? Could she help Ethan and the Alliance in time to stop the invasion? The pressure mounted as they worked tirelessly to strategize, to gather intel, to set up defenses for the coming battle. Ethan's trust in her was fragile, but with every passing moment, he began to see that she was committed to their cause. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It wasn't about her past. It was about doing what she could with the time they had left to protect the people she had once helped put at risk. As the two of them planned their next move, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. The enemy was already on the offensive, and their forces were overwhelming. But Laia and Ethan refused to back down. The tension was palpable in the command center as they put their plan into motion. The alien forces, which had been coordinating their attacks with surgical precision, were now facing a more prepared and determined enemy. Ethan had fought alongside many in his career, but he had never experienced this kind of partnership, this unity in the face of destruction. Laia was quick, precise, and tactical. She had a mind for strategy, able to anticipate the enemy's movements and adjust their defenses accordingly. Ethan's military experience was invaluable as well, especially when it came to engaging the enemy directly. Together, they formed a powerful team. The initial waves of attack came fast and fierce, but with Laia's expertise, they were able to intercept and neutralize several key strike forces. Their tactics, coordinating attacks with precise timing, using the environment to their advantage, began to turn the tide. But the true test would come when the enemy's full force arrived. Ethan and Laia knew they couldn't win this battle by defense alone. To break the enemy's momentum, they needed to take the fight to them. They hatched a daring plan, one that would require everything they had. It was risky, almost reckless, but it was their best chance to disrupt the invasion. The idea was simple: destroy the enemy's command ship, the center of their strategic operations. Without it, the enemy forces would fall into disarray, unable to coordinate their attacks. The task was monumental, and the danger was enormous. If they failed, it would mean the end of the Astral Voyager and anyone who was on it. Ethan and Laia shared a brief understanding glance before they set their plan into motion. Laia piloted the ship, guiding it through the maze of enemy vessels with unshakable focus. Ethan, his pulse racing with the anticipation of the mission, worked the weapon systems with precision, targeting the weak points of the enemy's ships as they advanced. The plan was set into motion. They would infiltrate the enemy's defenses, strike at the heart of their command, and leave before the rest of the fleet could retaliate. Laia's knowledge of alien tactics gave them an edge, while Ethan's combat prowess ensured that they could take out the enemy without leaving a trace. As the mission began, everything happened in a blur. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as Laia expertly maneuvered their ship through the enemy lines, dodging fire and weaving in and out of the destruction. Ethan's hands flew across the console, launching missile after missile to take down enemy vessels in their path. The enemy commander, oblivious to their approach, failed to react in time. Laia expertly deployed a series of decoys and hacked into the enemy's communication systems, creating confusion among their ranks. The command ship was vulnerable. It was now or never. Now Laia shouted, her voice sharp and filled with urgency. Ethan fired the final volley of missiles, and with a devastating explosion, the command ship erupted in flames. The remaining ships scattered, their once coordinated attack now in chaos. The battle wasn't over, but the enemy had been thrown off balance. The command ship was gone, and their forces were no longer able to coordinate their attacks effectively. It was a victory, a small one, but enough to turn the tide in their favor. The aftermath of their daring attack was still unfolding as the crew of the Astral Voyager breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had won the day, but the war was far from over. Laia and Ethan stood side by side, watching the remnants of the enemy fleet retreat into the vast expanse of space. "We did it," Ethan said, his voice a mix of disbelief and awe. Laia looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment before she nodded. "We did. But this isn't the end, Ethan. It's just the beginning." In that moment, despite everything that had happened between them, Ethan realized something: they had made it through the impossible together. And maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to continue fighting side by side for what was right. They had each other now, and that was enough. The astral Voyager drifted silently through the dark expanse of space, her hull battered and worn from the relentless assault. Laia and Ethan sat together in the cramped control room, the dim lights of the console casting long shadows on their faces. The air between them was thick with tension. They had successfully repelled the alien forces for now, but the ship was still in a precarious state, and the battle was far from over. Their next mission was clear, but not without peril. They had to return to the Galactic Alliance to bring the ship back to a secure station before the enemy forces regrouped. The problem was the path back was fraught with danger. There were still remnants of enemy ships in the area, and the Alliance wasn't sure what state they would find the Astral Voyager in once they arrived. Their enemies, too, would be looking for any sign of the ship's return. The first challenge was getting the ship there without being detected. The Voyager's systems were damaged and its sensors were barely functional. Laia worked tirelessly, rerouting power, bypassing damaged systems, and trying to bring everything back online. Ethan's mind, sharp as always, stayed focused on the immediate threat, the possibility that an enemy ship could still be lurking nearby, waiting to pounce the moment they were vulnerable. "We can't afford to get spotted," Laia said, her voice tight with concentration. "We'll need to take the long route back through the outer edges of the system. It's risky, but it's the only way we stand a chance of slipping past their patrols unnoticed." Ethan nodded, his hand resting on his blaster. He knew the risks. "How likely are we to make it there without being detected?" "It depends on how much time we have," Laia replied, her eyes scanning the flickering consoles. "If we can get a jump on them, we might be able to make it before they send reinforcements. But there's no guarantee." Their only hope was the secrecy of their movements. If they were careful enough, they might be able to sneak past the enemy without raising alarm. But if they were discovered, the consequences could be dire. The ship was far from its full fighting capacity, and while Laia and Ethan could hold their own, they couldn't fight an entire fleet. Ethan had already experienced the feeling of powerlessness before, and he was determined to do whatever it took to keep that feeling from surfacing again. His hand tightened on the console as he looked over at Laia. She might not have been the most traditional ally, but she was his ally now, and he would protect her just as fiercely as she had protected him. The mission wasn't as easy as they had hoped. The Alliance had been hesitant to offer their assistance after the betrayal Laia had been a part of. She was an ex-member of the faction after all, and her past actions still weighed heavily on the trust they were willing to extend to her. But there was no time to dwell on politics now. The ship was in dire need of help, and they needed the Alliance's resources. After weeks of pleading with their contacts within the Alliance, Laia and Ethan finally received confirmation the Alliance would help. But it came with a catch. There were only limited forces available, and the damage to the Astral Voyager was more extensive than they had anticipated. It would take time to get reinforcements, and even then, the risk of being attacked before they could reach safety was high. "Laia," a voice crackled over the comm. "This is Commander Orlan. We've agreed to send support, but I can't guarantee you'll make it out without a fight. You'll need to hold the line while we bring the cavalry." Laia's grip tightened on the console as she listened, but she didn't hesitate. "Understood, Commander. We'll do what we can. Just be prepared for anything," the commander added. This mission could get complicated. They had no choice but to trust the commander's word. But trust was fragile, especially for Laia, who had been in the Alliance's crosshairs just weeks ago. Ethan, too, felt the weight of their reliance on a system that had once cast them both aside. As reinforcements began to arrive, small ships at first, then larger, more capable vessels, the tension in Laia's chest began to ease just slightly. Still, they were not out of the woods. They had been through too much, and even with support from the Alliance, they were far from safe. It wasn't long before the enemy began closing in. The fear that they had been detected was confirmed as a shadow loomed on their scanners, a massive alien ship, much larger than anything they had seen before. The forces they had gathered from the Alliance had arrived, but they were still no match for the formidable enemy ship bearing down on them. Laia, Ethan said, his voice low and steady, we can't take this on head-on, not with the ship in its current state. We need to buy time for the reinforcements to arrive. But Laia knew what that meant. It meant sacrificing something. It meant taking a gamble with the lives of everyone aboard. We can't outrun them either, she replied, her voice grim. There's only one way this works: if we sacrifice the last of the ship's defensive systems and make a desperate push. It might buy us enough time. Ethan's face hardened. And you think that's worth the risk? Laia didn't hesitate. It's the only chance we have. There was a long pause. Ethan looked at her, his mind calculating the cost of such an action. If they failed, the ship would be lost. They would be lost. But if they succeeded... Ethan's resolve steeled. Then we fight. Together. As they initiated their final plan, it became clear that the fight wasn't just about the survival of the astral Voyager. It was about something bigger. Ethan and Laia's choices had led them to this moment. Their actions could either save or destroy the future of the Alliance. The final push came at a tremendous cost. Laia was forced to use the last of the ship's energy reserves to power the weapon systems, giving them one final burst of offensive power. But the cost was great. The ship's defenses were all but drained, and if the enemy retaliated, they would be completely exposed. Ethan stood ready at the tactical console, monitoring their position as Laia piloted them toward the enemy ship. They had only one chance, one shot at stopping them. It was a race against time, and every second counted. As the enemy ship fired, Laia executed a series of evasive maneuvers, avoiding the bulk of the shots while still managing to land several devastating blows to the enemy vessel. But the strain was too much for the ship's already weakened systems. The Voyager was falling apart piece by piece. We can't keep this up, Laia muttered, her voice strained. We need to finish this. But Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew the moment of sacrifice was upon them. The next attack would either break them or save them. Just one more hit, Ethan said, his voice unwavering. With one final coordinated strike, they disabled the enemy ship's central core. The ship's systems failed, and the immense alien vessel exploded in a dazzling show of lights and fire. But their victory came at a price. The astral Voyager's hull was badly damaged, and both Laia and Ethan were forced to make the hardest decision yet. Laia, knowing what it meant, made a final sacrifice. She gave her life to stabilize the ship's failing systems long enough to save the crew and allow them to escape the alien fleet's reach. Ethan, standing alone at the helm, watched as Laia's lifeless body was gently placed in a secure chamber. The cost of their survival weighed heavily on him, but as he looked out into the stars, he realized something. Laia's sacrifice had given them a chance. She had saved the future of the Alliance, and in doing so had changed their destiny forever. But it had come at the ultimate price. As the ship finally limped into the safety of an Alliance station, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, could they ever change the future they had fought for? Could they rebuild a galaxy torn apart by war, by lies, and by betrayal? Only time would tell. The stakes had never been higher. The final push to stop the alien invasion was imminent, and Ethan and Laia found themselves facing the most critical part of their journey. Their plan was set into motion, but it was anything but foolproof. Every move they made could either save the galaxy or spell its doom. The weight of their choices hung heavily on them as they prepared for the ultimate confrontation. Their strategy was simple: strike at the heart of the alien invasion. The command ship, the one directing the entire offensive, was their target. Taking it down would dismantle the entire coordination of the enemy forces, creating chaos and disarray among their ranks. But that wasn't the only objective. Ethan and Laia knew that they had to do it quickly and decisively before the enemy could regroup. Every moment of delay would give the invaders more time to retaliate. The problem, of course, was that attacking the heart of the invasion would put them directly in the line of fire. The alien fleet was formidable, and their defenses were impenetrable. Getting close enough to disable the command ship was an almost impossible task, requiring precision timing and, above all, luck. This was the kind of mission that could result in death before they even reached their target. Ethan and Laia both knew the risks, but there was no other choice. The galaxy depended on them. Their plan was clear. Laia would navigate them through the enemy lines, while Ethan worked with the ship's weapon systems to destroy any enemies in their path. But they were running out of time. The longer they took to execute their plan, the greater the chance that the enemy would detect them and neutralize their attack. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage, but that advantage was fleeting. Victory in battle wasn't just about weapons or tactics, it was about unity. Ethan had spent most of his life relying on himself, trusting only his instincts and his training. Laia, too, had fought many battles on her own, using her skills as a pilot to stay one step ahead of the enemy. But in this moment, they realized that no amount of firepower would save them. They needed each other, and they needed their team. Their bond had grown over the course of the mission, from the initial distrust and tension to a mutual respect forged in the heat of battle. The trust they had built with one another was now their greatest asset. The entire crew had been affected by Laia's past, and the revelations about her betrayal had caused a rift. But in the heat of the final battle, all that mattered was their shared goal: survival. Ethan and Laia had proven that they could fight side by side. Now it was up to them to unite the crew as well. There was no time to dwell on the past. The crew knew what Laia had done, but they also knew that she had proven herself by fighting beside them, by helping them overcome the impossible. They had to focus on the mission, on the fight ahead, or they wouldn't have a future to fight for. But as the battle raged on, the question lingered. Would one of them have to make the ultimate sacrifice to ensure victory? Would Laia's past deeds haunt her future? Or would her willingness to fight for redemption prove to be the key to their success? As the plan moved into its final phase, Laia was confronted with a decision that could change everything. The battle was intensifying, and their time was running out. They were closing in on the alien command ship, but they still hadn't taken out the remaining defenses. Laia could see the path ahead, the narrow opening through which they would have to fly to reach their target. It was a risky maneuver, one that would put them right in the line of fire. Their chances of success were slim, and the consequences of failure were dire. Laia knew that if they couldn't disable the command ship in the next few minutes, the alien fleet would regroup and wipe them out. But there was something else that weighed heavily on her mind. Ethan, standing beside her in the cockpit, was still a constant presence in her life, a reminder of everything she had done wrong. Could she continue to fight beside him, knowing that her past would always be a part of their present? Laia's eyes flickered to the control panel, her fingers poised above the keys. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. The mission was everything, but so was Ethan. The thought of leaving him behind, of sacrificing their bond for the sake of the mission, was something she couldn't bear. "I can't do this without you," Laia said quietly, her voice betraying the doubt that had crept in. She didn't know if she could make it through this fight without knowing that they were both fully committed, fully together in this battle. Ethan turned to her, his expression serious. "We're in this together, Laia. No matter what happens next, we're a team. We always have been." His words gave her the strength she needed. In that moment, she realized that her past, her mistakes, her regrets didn't have to define her. She could still be a force for good. She could still fight for something worth saving. They worked together, their movements synchronized as they prepared to make the final push. Laia's hands flew across the controls, and Ethan focused on the weapon systems lining up their final attack. They were going in, and they weren't turning back. As they closed in on the alien command ship, Laia and Ethan knew that there would be no second chances. This was their moment, their final shot. The entire galaxy was depending on them. But as they engaged the final defense systems, something unexpected happened. A new wave of enemy reinforcements appeared, and their already weakened ship began to take on more damage. The command ship loomed closer, its defenses still strong, but their path was clear. Laia and Ethan shared a brief, fleeting moment of understanding. They both knew what this meant. If they didn't succeed in this mission, it would mean the end of everything they had fought for. The final push was nothing short of desperate. Laia steered the ship with unparalleled skill, dodging incoming fire, while Ethan fired the final volley that would pierce the heart of the enemy ship. The explosion that followed was massive, blinding light and deafening sound filled the cockpit as the command ship collapsed into the stars. It wasn't a perfect victory. The ship was damaged, the crew exhausted. But they had succeeded. The alien forces had been thrown into chaos, and the tide had turned in their favor. The galaxy wasn't saved yet, but they had won a crucial battle. In the aftermath, as the crew began to assess the damage, Laia and Ethan stood at the helm, looking out into the vastness of space. Laia knew that there was still much to be done. There were still threats out there, and they would have to keep fighting. But for now there was a moment of peace, a fragile peace that was hard-won. As the remnants of the alien fleet scattered, Laia faced a new decision. Could she continue to fight beside Ethan, knowing that their victory had come with sacrifices? Could she move forward without being held back by the weight of her past? Ethan's gaze met hers, and for a brief moment there was understanding between them. There was no simple answer, no clear path forward. But together they had changed the course of history. They had proven that even in the face of betrayal there was still room for redemption. There was still a chance for the future. Their fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Laia allowed herself to believe that it could be a fight worth winning. The chaos erupted faster than either Laia or Ethan could anticipate. The plan they had so carefully crafted, the one they had staked everything on, began to unravel in real time. As Laia maneuvered the ship through the alien defenses, a sudden alarm blared across the bridge. Her hands moved instinctively, trying to assess the damage, but it was already too late. What happened? Ethan's voice was sharp, his eyes scanning the rapidly flashing warnings on the console. They found us, Laia said through clenched teeth, her fingers flying across the controls. Somehow they detected us. The cover's blown. Ethan's chest tightened. They had been so careful, so calculated in their approach. How could they have been discovered? Impossible, he muttered. We were too careful. But Laia didn't have an answer. She was too focused on the ship's systems to respond. It doesn't matter now, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil. We need to adapt fast. They're already mobilizing their forces. If we don't move now, we won't get another chance. Ethan gritted his teeth, the sudden shift in the battle making the air in the cockpit feel thick and suffocating. How the hell did they know? His mind raced, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. Must have been the ship's signature, Laia muttered. I missed something. They were prepared for us. Her voice dropped to a low murmur, barely audible over the thrumming of the ship's engines. They were waiting. A cold realization settled in Ethan's gut. It's a trap. They knew we were coming. A jolt ran through the ship as enemy fire rocked the hull. Laia's hands moved frantically, attempting to regain control, but the damage was already done. The mission they had fought so hard to execute was now hanging by a thread. They knew exactly where we'd hit. They set the trap. Ethan's voice was filled with frustration and disbelief. But why? Who tipped them off? Laia's brow furrowed. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her tone low and cautious. Maybe it's not a betrayal. Maybe we just missed something. Something small. I don't know, but we don't have time to figure that out now. Ethan turned away from the console, his eyes narrowing. Or maybe we've been betrayed. Laia's gaze flicked up, meeting his eyes for a brief, charged moment. I don't want to believe that. Not after everything we've been through? He didn't answer. The suspicion lingered in the air, but there was no time to delve into it. The alien forces were closing in fast. Laia knew they had no choice but to push forward, but the risks were greater than ever. They had been forced into a desperate situation, and now their only option was to make it out alive. We can still fight, Laia said, her voice steady but urgent. But it won't be easy. If we don't act fast, they'll tear us apart before we even get close to the command ship. Ethan looked at her, his jaw tight. Then we fight. Together. The tension was unbearable as the situation grew more dire. Laia and Ethan knew they were no longer in control of the outcome. The enemy forces, aware of their approach now, were moving with deadly precision. Laia swerved the ship to avoid another barrage of fire, her eyes scanning the sensors desperately for any sign of hope. This is it, Ethan said, his voice a quiet growl. If we don't stop that command ship, it's all over. Laia nodded grimly. The enemy was closing in, and their fleet was massive. She could see it now, the vast array of enemy ships surrounding them, cutting off any hope of retreat. We don't have a choice, she said. If we don't take down that ship, there won't be any tomorrow. Ethan's gaze turned back toward the view screen, his expression hardening. The moment of reckoning had come. There was no turning back now. Laia, he began, his voice softer than usual but still filled with determination. Whatever happens, we make this count. We can't afford to fail. She glanced at him, her own resolve hardening. We won't fail. The plan to destroy the alien command ship was simple, but its execution was anything but. Laia and Ethan fought with everything they had, navigating through the swarm of enemy ships that closed in around them. The tension was unbearable. Every move was crucial, every second counted. The alien forces were relentless, and their firepower was overwhelming. But Laia's experience and Ethan's tenacity kept them on track. As the battle raged, Ethan found himself wondering just how much longer they could hold on. The ship's hull was taking more damage with every strike, and the enemy was getting closer to launching a full-scale assault. They couldn't keep dodging forever. If they didn't disable the command ship, the aliens would regroup and launch a devastating final assault. The consequences would be catastrophic. Ethan gritted his teeth, the sound of the ship's systems crackling around them. "We need to finish this now." Laia nodded, her focus unwavering as she adjusted the ship's trajectory to make one final pass at the command ship. One shot, one chance. As they closed in on the alien command ship, Laia's heart raced. The enemy was coming at them from all sides, and they couldn't afford to hesitate. She fired the final shot, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Then the explosion ripped through the heart of the alien ship, sending shock waves through the enemy fleet. It wasn't over, but it was a victory. The command ship was gone, and the alien forces were thrown into disarray. Ethan's voice came through, strained but filled with the rush of victory. "We did it. They're falling apart." But as the remnants of the enemy fleet began to scatter, another harsh reality set in. The cost of their victory had been high, and the damage to the ship was severe. Laia looked over at Ethan, a single thought crossing her mind. They had won, but at what cost? The battle was far from over, and they had no way of knowing if they would survive the aftermath. Laia's thoughts shifted as she steered the ship through the remaining chaos. The moment of victory felt fleeting, and now she was faced with a decision that weighed on her more than anything else. "Ethan," she said, her voice uncharacteristically quiet, "there's something I need to tell you." He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, the weight of what she was about to say pressing on her chest. "I don't know how much longer we have. I've fought for so long, and I've made so many mistakes. But if we don't get out of here soon," Ethan cut her off, his voice firm. "Don't. We're not done yet." She looked at him, meeting his gaze. They both knew the stakes. The fight wasn't over, but the future of the galaxy and their own lives hung in the balance. There was still a chance. There had to be. But the price of victory, both for the galaxy and for their own survival, was still unknown. The sound of the ship's warning alarms filled the bridge, the steady pulse of the alert ringing in Laia's ears. The walls seemed to close in on her as she stared at the rapidly flashing consoles. The battle was reaching its breaking point, and she knew that time was running out. They were so close to victory, but they wouldn't make it if they didn't act fast. The ship was barely holding together, the hull damaged beyond repair, and the enemy was closing in from every direction. They needed a way out, but it would require a sacrifice. Laia's fingers hovered over the console, her gaze flickering between the blinking lights and the tactical display. She had already pushed the ship beyond its limits, but the energy reserves were nearly depleted. The weapons were barely functional, and their shields had failed. They couldn't outrun the enemy. She glanced at Ethan, his face set in determination, though there was a deep worry in his eyes. He knew the situation was dire. "Laia, what's the status?" Ethan's voice was tight urgency bleeding through. "We're not going to make it," she replied, her voice calm but filled with the weight of the moment. "Not unless I do something drastic." Ethan frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean there has to be another way?" She shook her head, feeling the tight knot of resolve form in her chest. "There isn't. Not unless I sacrifice myself." He froze, his eyes searching hers, trying to make sense of her words. "You're talking about..." "What you can't be serious, Laia. We'll figure something out. I'll figure something out." But Laia knew the truth. They were running out of time. If she didn't take control now, they'd all be lost. She had learned how to fight for the greater good, but this was the price she had to pay. The price of redemption. "You can't stop me, Ethan," she said softly, her voice breaking just a little. "It's the only way." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but his words faltered. Deep down, he knew she was right. He knew there was no other way to ensure their survival. They had been through too much, fought too hard, and now it was time for Laia to make the ultimate sacrifice. He wanted to stop her, wanted to believe that there was another option, but as he looked into her eyes, he realized the truth. Laia. His voice was thick with emotion, but he couldn't bring himself to say more. What could he say? I've made my choice. She said, her voice steady. Now I need you to make yours. Let me do this, Ethan. The room fell silent, and Ethan felt the weight of the decision settle over him like a heavy cloak. He had fought beside Laia, trusted her with his life, and now he had to let her go. The decision Laia made was not only hers to bear, it was one that would echo through the rest of the crew, shaping their actions for the remainder of the war. Her sacrifice was not just for the survival of the ship, it was for them all. As Laia moved toward the core of the ship's engines, preparing to initiate the sequence that would overload the system and trigger a devastating blast that would take out the enemy, the crew began to realize what was happening. The alarms blared and the energy readings spiked as she set everything into motion. They all knew what it meant. Ethan stood in the doorway, helpless, watching as Laia worked quickly, her hands moving with purpose. There was no stopping it now. Laia, he said quietly, his voice hoarse, you don't have to do this. But she only looked at him once, a sad smile on her lips. It's the only way, Ethan. You know that. This is how we win. As the countdown to the ship's self-destruct began, Ethan's heart felt like it was being ripped from his chest. This was the cost of war. This was the price of fighting for something bigger than yourself. But as the seconds ticked down, a deep understanding settled over him. This was Laia's choice, and she had made it for them, for the galaxy. The blast was inevitable, but so was the pain of losing someone who had become more than just a comrade. Laia had been his partner, his equal in every way, and now she was giving everything to protect them all. When the explosion rocked the ship, it was a blinding burst of light and energy that ripped through the void. The shock wave shattered the alien fleet's command structure and sent them scattering into disarray. But it was the last thing Laia would ever do. The crew felt the loss immediately. There was no cheering, no victorious celebration. They had won, yes, but at an immense cost. Laia's absence left a void that none of them knew how to fill. Ethan stood alone in the wreckage of the command room, staring at the spot where she had stood just moments before. The silence was deafening. He could still feel the weight of her presence, her resolve, her unwavering commitment to the cause. And now that resolve had saved them all. But it had also broken him. For the rest of the crew, the reality of Laia's sacrifice didn't hit until the dust began to settle. In the aftermath of the explosion, as they limped back to safety, the crew members turned their attention to each other. Laia had given everything so they could survive. Her name would be remembered, but her sacrifice would be felt long after the war ended. Ethan, though shattered by the loss, found himself rising to lead. He knew that the fight was far from over, and that Laia's memory would live on in every battle they fought from here on out. She had shown them the meaning of true sacrifice, and her example would be what pushed them forward. We keep fighting, Ethan said, his voice quiet but resolute. For Laia, for all of us. The crew nodded in solemn agreement. Laia's sacrifice had given them a new purpose, a new reason to keep going. They would fight not just for victory, but to honor the legacy of the woman who had given everything for them. In the days that followed, as the crew continued their mission, they would remember Laia not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of everything they were fighting for: redemption, loyalty, and the hope of a better future. Her sacrifice had forged a new bond between them all, one stronger than any weapon or strategy could ever create. Laia would never be forgotten, and the war would continue, but now it would be fought in her memory. The aftermath of Laia's sacrifice was overwhelming. In the wake of the explosion that had torn through the heart of the alien fleet, the remaining ships were left in chaos. The command structure was decimated, leaving the enemy forces in disarray. The strategic advantage that had seemed insurmountable was now slipping through their fingers, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to hope. Despite everything, the bloodshed, the betrayal, and the sacrifice, there was a chance. The final phase of Laia's plan had been executed to perfection. The alien forces, unable to regroup without their command ship, were scattered, vulnerable, and retreating. What had seemed like an impossible victory had, against all odds, been achieved. It wasn't a clean win, and it certainly hadn't come without loss, but it was a win nonetheless. Ethan stood at the helm, staring out at the remnants of the alien fleet retreating into the void. The battle was over, but the cost was far too great to celebrate. He could feel the emptiness where Laia had once stood, the place she had occupied in their shared mission, now a void that nothing could fill. The victory, though hard won, carried with it a bittersweet sting. "She did it," Ethan whispered under his breath almost to himself. "We did it." It felt unreal, as if the universe had defied the odds to grant them this one last chance. But there was no denying it. The enemy was retreating. Their offensive crippled their plans in tatters. Despite Laia's sacrifice, the mission had succeeded. They had won. The galaxy had been given a reprieve, even if it had come at the cost of the one person who had truly understood the meaning of sacrifice. Despite Laia's sacrifice, her final plan succeeded. The events that followed Laia's death were filled with both triumph and grief. The devastation to the alien fleet was so overwhelming that their forces scattered, unable to maintain any form of coordinated attack. The remnants of their ships fled into the dark corners of space, no longer posing a threat to the galaxy. Ethan, still processing the loss of his closest ally, understood that their victory wasn't just a stroke of luck. Laia had set this up, she had orchestrated it all, and in doing so had written her own final chapter of redemption. The success of the mission, despite the heavy cost, was proof that she had not died in vain. The galaxy had been saved from the brink of destruction. There was a strange sense of justice in the way things had unfolded. The alien forces that had wreaked havoc on countless systems for years, destroying lives and civilizations, were now in retreat. Their defeat was no small matter, but it was the culmination of years of suffering, of struggle, and of the sacrifice of someone who had once been their enemy. For Ethan, it was a moment of vindication, not for the past mistakes, but for the future. And perhaps it was a form of revenge, too sweetened by the knowledge that Laia's sacrifice had struck the decisive blow. The Galactic Alliance decides to change course and calls for peace with the alien factions. In the aftermath of the battle, the Galactic Alliance found itself in a rare position of strength. The aliens, despite their retreat, had been humbled. Their forces had been significantly weakened, their command structure in ruins. The Alliance, emboldened by the victory and aware of the fragility of the situation, took the unexpected step of offering peace talks. Ethan had never expected this outcome. He had lived through too many wars, too many losses, to believe that peace was ever truly an option. Yet here they were, with the galaxy teetering on the edge of a new reality. The Alliance leadership, spurred on by the victory they had achieved, issued a formal call for peace, hoping to open a new chapter in relations with the alien factions. It was an unprecedented move, one that would have been unthinkable only a few months ago. But in the wake of Laia's sacrifice, the tone of the entire conflict shifted. The message was clear. It was time for reconciliation, for rebuilding, for putting an end to the endless cycle of violence. Could peace truly be achieved after so much blood had been spilled? Ethan wasn't sure. But he knew that the death of his friend and ally had changed the course of history, and perhaps, just perhaps, it would pave the way for a future where violence was no longer the first option. Would the alien factions be willing to listen? Would they put aside their centuries of conflict to work with the Alliance? Only time would tell. But the fact that peace was even an option now felt like a victory of its own. Ethan's life changes, but he can never forget Laia. For Ethan, the war was not over. Though the enemy had been defeated, the wounds of the past, Laia's sacrifice, the toll of battle would stay with him. The galaxy was safe for now, but the future was uncertain. He had a new mission to help rebuild, to ensure that Laia's death wasn't in vain. But life would never be the same again. Ethan felt the weight of her absence in every quiet moment, in every decision he made. The loss of Laia wasn't something he could simply move past. It would be with him forever. "I'll keep fighting," he muttered to himself, standing on the observation deck of the ship, staring out into the endless stars. "I'll fight for you, Laia, for what we started." Her memory would always guide him, reminding him of the price of freedom, of the sacrifices that had been made to ensure that peace could one day exist. He didn't know what the future held for him or for the rest of the crew. The war was over, but there were still so many questions, so many things left unfinished. But Ethan was ready to face whatever came next. For Laia, for the future, for peace. As the crew of the Astral Voyager prepared to move forward, they knew that Laia's sacrifice would not be forgotten. Her story, the story of a woman who had given everything for redemption, would be told for generations to come. She had fought not just for victory, but for something more, for the hope that one day the universe might know peace. Her legacy would live on not as a cautionary tale, but as an inspiration. It would push them to continue the fight to build a future worth living for. And maybe just maybe they would create a world where no one else would have to make the same sacrifice. The war had ended. The sounds of battle, the gunfire, the screams of pain, and the endless orders had fallen silent. In the aftermath, the once devastated planets began to rebuild slowly, painstakingly. The wounds of war were still fresh, but the hope of peace was a balm for the soul. Yet as time passed, the reality of what they had fought for settled heavily on their hearts. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but that normalcy was fragile. The question on everyone's mind was whether this peace, this brief respite, would last. Would they be able to hold on to it, or was it just the calm before the next storm? Ethan watched as the new government officials, representatives from various species, both human and alien, worked together to draft policies for the future. Their efforts were noble, but the cracks in their unity were still visible. Old wounds festering from years of distrust and hatred had not yet healed. There were whispers in the halls of power doubts about whether true peace could ever be achieved, especially with the galaxy's history of war and betrayal. Ethan couldn't help but wonder, had it all been worth it? The cost of peace had been astronomical. Lives had been lost, alliances broken, and the very fabric of civilization torn apart. And Laia, the one person who had truly given everything, was gone. How could anyone ever repay that price? "Do you think this will last?" Ethan asked, his voice low, as he sat across from one of the newly appointed leaders of the Galactic Alliance. The leader, a woman who had seen the worst of the war, hesitated before answering. "I hope so, but peace is always a fragile thing. The question is, how long will we be able to hold on to it before something else breaks?" Ethan knew all too well how fragile peace could be. He had seen it unravel in an instant, the smallest spark igniting another conflict. And yet here they were trying to rebuild, trying to prove that they could learn from the past. But was it enough? Had they truly changed? Or was it just the calm before the next cycle of war and destruction? As the Galactic Alliance moved forward, discussions about the future began to take shape. The questions were not easy. How could they maintain peace when so many alien factions were still unstable? How could they create a lasting harmony when distrust ran so deep? Key figures in the new government, including some from the alien races who had fought alongside the Alliance, began to formulate strategies for maintaining peace. There were talks of new alliances, new treaties, and new systems of governance that would ensure that the horrors of war would never happen again. But every conversation was tainted by the reality that not everyone wanted peace. Not every alien faction had the same interest in coexisting with humanity. Ethan stood on the fringes of these meetings, watching from the shadows as the politicians and military leaders debated the future of the galaxy. He could see the resolve in their eyes, but he could also see the cracks, fleeting moments of doubt. The peace they had fought for was a victory, but at what cost? In a small, dimly lit room far from the bustling halls of the newly established government, a familiar voice broke through Ethan's thoughts. "You're not going to find the answers here, you know," said the voice. It was another member of the crew, someone who had fought beside him during the war. They had both seen too much to believe in easy answers. "I don't know what I'm looking for anymore," Ethan replied, his voice raw with the weight of everything that had happened. "I thought I did. I thought it was about saving the galaxy. But now I wonder if it's even worth it." "You're not the only one who's asking that," the crew member said quietly. "But we can't undo what's happened. We can't change the past. All we can do is make sure it doesn't happen again. And we can make sure Laia didn't die for nothing." The words hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the cost of peace. Laia's death had been a turning point for everyone. She had given everything to ensure that the war would end, to ensure that they could rebuild. But how could they move on from such a sacrifice? How could they ensure that it had been worth it? For Ethan, the future was unclear. The war was over, but the scars it had left were not so easily healed. He had seen the worst of humanity and the best, and now he was faced with the question of what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. Laia's sacrifice had been the catalyst for their victory, but it had also shattered something inside him. He couldn't forget her, no matter how hard he tried. Would he continue to fight for a peaceful future, or would he walk away from it all? Would the weight of her memory drive him forward, or would it push him into retreat? "I'll keep fighting," Ethan said to himself quietly in the stillness of the empty room. For her, for all of us. The galaxy, as beautiful and fragile as it was, would never forget Laia, and Ethan knew that he couldn't walk away. There was too much left to do, too much at stake, but the pain of her loss would never leave him. It would drive him to be better, to fight harder, and to build a future worth fighting for. But could he ever truly find peace? Could he ever let go of the war? The scars, the losses, the sacrifices, they would stay with him no matter where he went. And yet, as he watched the dawn break over the horizon of the new world, a sense of purpose filled him. He would fight, yes, but this time he would fight for something different, for a future that was brighter than the one they had left behind. As the last remnants of the war were laid to rest and the rebuilding process began, Ethan knew that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. There would be more battles to fight, more sacrifices to make. But in the back of his mind, Laia's legacy lived on. She had given everything for a chance at peace, and now it was up to him and the rest of humanity to ensure that her death had not been in vain. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, small, fragile, but real. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: the fight for peace was far from over, and he would never stop fighting for it. But for now, as the war was finally over, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Laia had given everything, and now it was up to him to carry that torch forward. Ethan stood alone in the quiet of the observatory, staring out at the stars. The galaxy, once so full of chaos and conflict, now seemed at peace, or at least a fragile peace. The war was over, but the consequences of everything that had happened still hung heavy. He had survived. He had fought. And now, in the aftermath of it all, Ethan's story would be remembered. But would it be enough? His journey, his sacrifice, had already become a tale among the survivors. The people who had fought beside him, the crew of the Astral Voyager, would pass down the story of their struggle to future generations. Would it become a legend? Would humanity look back on their efforts and see something more than just a fleeting victory? "I never thought I'd make it this far," Ethan whispered to himself, the weight of everything he'd been through pressing down on his shoulders. His hands rested on the railing, and he allowed his thoughts to wander. His story was one of survival, of relentless fighting against insurmountable odds. But it was more than that. It was about the humanity he had fought for, the legacy he was trying to create. Would his journey inspire those who came after him? Would the people of the future look back and see the victory, not just as the end of a war, but the beginning of a new era? Could they learn from the mistakes of the past, or would history repeat itself? The question gnawed at him, but in the end, it was a question he couldn't answer. All he could do was continue living, continue fighting for the hope that his sacrifices and those of his fallen comrades had not been in vain. Peace might be fragile, but it was the only thing worth striving for. And even if it didn't last, the fight would continue for the future of humanity, for the future of every civilization. Even though Laia was gone, her influence on the galaxy would never fade. Her death had been the turning point in the war, but it had also been the spark of something greater. In her final moments, Laia had chosen to sacrifice herself for something bigger than herself, a future where peace was possible. Her story would live on, carried by the very people who had fought alongside her. She had been more than just a soldier. She had been a symbol of change, a woman who had been willing to challenge everything she knew in order to fight for a better future, no matter the personal cost. Would Laia be remembered as a hero? Absolutely. But she would also be remembered as a symbol, one who showed the galaxy that redemption was possible. Her actions had bridged gaps between civilizations, between species, in ways no one had ever thought possible. The story of Laia's bravery, her sacrifice, would be passed down for generations. As the years went by, her name would be spoken with reverence, her actions chronicled in history. She would become a figure of hope for those who believed in change, a guiding light for those who fought for peace. Her legacy wasn't just about the war or the victory. It was about what she had stood for: the belief that no matter how dark the galaxy seemed, there was always the possibility of a better future. And in that future, she would always have a place. With the war behind them, the Galactic Alliance stood at a crossroads. The peace they had fought for was now in their hands. Would they be able to maintain it, or would the cycle of violence begin anew? The leaders of the Alliance, both human and alien, worked tirelessly to build a new world. A world where cooperation rather than conflict would be the foundation of their future. But the challenges were immense. There were still factions out there, both within and outside the Alliance, that sought to undermine everything they had worked for. Trust had to be earned not just between different species, but between the Alliance's own factions. Could they truly keep the peace? Ethan wasn't sure. But he knew that the fight wasn't over, even if the war had ended. Peace had to be maintained, fought for every day, or it would slip away like the sand through your fingers. And yet there was hope. The first steps toward cooperation were shaky, but they were there. Humanity and the alien species who had once been enemies were now talking, working together to find common ground. It was a fragile alliance, but it was a start. Could the relationships between species evolve further, reaching a point where they didn't just tolerate each other but thrive together? Ethan had his doubts, but as he looked around at the people working side by side, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Ethan's journey was far from over. The war had ended, but the scars of the past still lingered. He had lost so much: his family, his friends, his comrades. But Laya's sacrifice had changed him. It had given him purpose. He would fight for the peace that they had won, even if it meant continuing to sacrifice pieces of himself along the way. But what about his future? Would he continue to serve the Alliance, leading its efforts to rebuild and maintain peace? Or would he finally walk away from the battlefield, seeking a life beyond the war? As the years passed, Ethan did just that. He continued to fight for the future of humanity, for the future of the galaxy, but he also found a place for himself outside of the endless cycle of battle. He eventually took a position within the Alliance, helping to guide the next generation of leaders, ensuring that Laya's sacrifice would never be forgotten. But in the quiet moments when the weight of everything pressed down on him, Ethan often found himself lost in memories of Laya, the woman who had given everything for the future. He would never forget her. Her legacy would be a part of him forever. And whenever he needed strength, whenever he felt like giving up, he would think of her and know that her sacrifice had made the future possible. The galaxy had witnessed countless wars, countless struggles, but none had impacted the course of history as profoundly as the war that had been fought between the Alliance and the alien invaders. The victory, though hard-won and steeped in sacrifice, had become a legend, a story that would echo throughout time. It wasn't just a story of soldiers or battles. It was the story of humanity, of the strength of spirit, and of the ultimate price paid for peace. The tale of Laya's sacrifice, of Ethan's unyielding determination, and of the people who fought beside them would live on long after they were gone. It would be told and retold, passed down as a beacon of hope and courage for generations to come. The legacy they had created would continue to inspire not just humanity, but every race, every civilization that now called the galaxy home. Would this legend live forever? Would it be celebrated for eons as the turning point for peace in the galaxy? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the values they had fought for would never be forgotten. The lessons learned from their sacrifice, loyalty, honor, selflessness would continue to resonate in the hearts of those who inherited their dream. The memory of Laya and Ethan would be etched into the very fabric of the galaxy's future, and the struggle they had endured would continue to inspire those who had not yet experienced the horrors of war. The victory they had achieved, the peace they had forged, was not just their own, it was the inheritance of all sentient beings. The galaxy had been torn apart by war, but it had been brought back together by an unbreakable will. Peace was a difficult thing to attain, a fragile thing that demanded constant vigilance, but it wasn't beyond reach. Laya's sacrifice, Ethan's unwavering commitment, and the efforts of countless others had shown the galaxy that peace could be built, even from the ashes of war. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was possible. Could peace be built from the suffering, from the scars left by years of bloodshed? Could the past, with all its pain and loss, lead to a better future? The story of Laya and Ethan, of their courage and determination, was proof that even the greatest of sacrifices could lead to something more. They had given everything to stop the violence, and now their story would be a guide for those who came after. The lessons learned from the war would not be forgotten. The difficult choices made, the painful losses endured, all served to show that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to fight for something better. And just as the galaxy had rebuilt after the war, so too could it rebuild itself after the scars of its past. Peace was not an ideal that could be easily realized, but it was one worth striving for. Could Laia and Ethan's story inspire others to build a future free of war? Could it be the spark that led to true unity, true collaboration among all the species of the galaxy? Perhaps, but only if the galaxy was willing to learn from the mistakes of the past and work toward a common future. For Ethan, the battle was over, but the war within himself had just begun. The war had left him scarred, not just physically, but emotionally. He had lost so much: his family, his comrades, and now Laia. The woman who had stood by his side through it all was gone, and the pain of her sacrifice was something he would carry with him forever. But Ethan had always been a soldier, and soldiers don't stop fighting just because the battle is over. Laia's sacrifice had given him purpose, a purpose he would carry for the rest of his life. Her legacy was now his burden to bear, and he would honor it by continuing the fight she had died for. There was still work to be done. The galaxy was still fragile, and the Alliance was still rebuilding. Ethan knew he couldn't do it alone, but he also knew that he couldn't give up now. The cost of peace had been too high, the sacrifices too great. For Laia, for all those they had lost, for the future. Would Ethan find a new purpose, a new life beyond the battlefield? Or would he remain bound to the war forever, shaped by the loss of those he had loved? He didn't know. He didn't have the answers. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. The future wasn't set in stone, and though the road ahead was uncertain, it was a road he would walk one step at a time. He would carry Laia's memory with him always. It would guide him, push him forward, and remind him of what truly mattered. It was no longer just about survival. It was about creating something worth fighting for, something worth living for. The galaxy, scarred by years of war, stood on the brink of something new. A new era was dawning, one filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. The Alliance, though fragile, was beginning to unite the disparate factions that had once been divided. Species that had once been enemies were now learning to coexist, to collaborate, and to build a future together. But there was no denying that the road ahead would be difficult. The wounds of war ran deep, and trust would take time to rebuild. The legacy of Laia and Ethan, of those who had given everything for peace, would be the foundation on which the new galaxy was built. The questions about whether true peace could ever be sustained would continue to echo throughout the galaxy, but the fight for it had already begun. Would the galaxy continue to fight for peace, or would old grudges and divisions resurface? Would the lessons learned from the war be enough to guide them toward a brighter future? Only time would tell, but for now the flame of hope had been lit. The war had ended, and now the real work could begin. For Ethan, the journey had just begun. He would continue the fight not just for himself, but for Laia, for the fallen, and for the future of a galaxy that had finally earned the chance to find peace. And whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the knowledge that he had the strength to carry on. For Laia, for the galaxy, for all of them. In the end, Laia's story would be passed down for generations, not as just a legend, but as a guiding light. Her courage, her sacrifice would inspire future generations to reach for something better, to build a future where peace could truly exist. And as for Ethan, the fight was no longer just about surviving, it was about living for something worth fighting for. A future where humanity and all the species of the galaxy could finally find peace. In the quiet aftermath of the war, the galaxy slowly began to rebuild. The sacrifices made by Laia, Ethan, and countless others would never be forgotten. Laia's legacy became a symbol of hope and redemption, inspiring future generations to fight for peace, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Her story lived on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed the cost of war and understood the value of peace. Ethan, forever shaped by the sacrifices of his comrades, continued his journey. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to honor the memory of those lost. The war was over, but the work had just begun. The galaxy, though scarred, now had a chance at a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to trust, and to find a lasting peace. As the stars stretched out before him, Ethan felt a quiet sense of resolve. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And no matter the cost, he would keep fighting for that future. For Laia, for the galaxy, for a tomorrow worth living for.